the face of evil. There is a question that has haunted humanity since the beginning of moral consciousness. Why do people do evil? Not the casual thoughtlessness, not the minor transgressions we all commit, but the truly monstrous acts, the deliberate infliction of suffering, the systematic destruction of human dignity, the horrors that make us turn away in revulsion and ask, how could anyone do such a thing? We want to believe that evil is other, that it belongs to monsters and psychopaths, to a different species of human being entirely. We want to draw a clear line between us and them, between the good people and the evil ones, between those capable of atrocity and those who would never, could never, commit such acts. This belief comforts us. It allows us to sleep at night. It permits us to maintain our self-image as fundamentally decent people. But the most disturbing truth that psychology reveals is this: evil is not other. It is not alien to human nature. It is woven into the same fabric that produces love and compassion and sacrifice. The capacity for evil lives in every human psyche, dormant perhaps, suppressed certainly, but present nonetheless. Given the right circumstances, the right pressures, the right justifications, almost anyone can commit acts they would have once thought unimaginable. Hannah Arendt, studying the Nazi bureaucrat Adolf Eichmann, expected to find a monster. Instead, she found an ordinary man, banal in his ordinariness, who committed monstrous acts while believing himself to be doing his duty. She called it the banality of evil, and the concept is more terrifying than any demonic possession, because it means that evil does not require exceptional depravity. It requires only ordinary obedience, ordinary conformity, ordinary moral blindness. The psychology of evil is the study of how human beings, fundamentally similar to ourselves, become capable of the unthinkable. The nature of evil. Psychological foundations. To understand evil, we must first define it, and this is far more difficult than it appears. Is evil the intention to harm, but surgeons harm to heal? Is it the causing of suffering, but parents cause suffering when they discipline children? Is it the violation of moral norms? But moral norms vary across cultures and throughout history. What one society calls evil, another calls necessary or even virtuous. Perhaps evil is better understood not as a specific act, but as a quality of relationship to others and to moral reality. Evil occurs when we treat other human beings as objects rather than as subjects, when we deny their humanity, when we use them as means to our ends, without regard for their inherent worth and dignity. Evil is the reduction of the other to a thing, to an obstacle, to a resource, to something less than fully human. The philosopher Martin Buber's distinction between I-it and I-thou relationships is crucial here. In I-thou, we encounter the other as a full person, as a consciousness like our own, deserving of recognition and respect. In I-it, we relate to the other as an object, as something to be used or manipulated or discarded. Evil, in this framework, is the systematic choosing of I-it over I-thou, the refusal to recognize the humanity of others. But this refusal is not usually conscious or deliberate. Most people who commit evil acts do not think of themselves as evil. They have constructed psychological frameworks that make their actions appear justified, necessary, even righteous. This is the crucial insight. Evil almost always believes itself to be good, or at least necessary in service of a greater good. The psychologist Roy Baumeister studied perpetrators of violence and cruelty and found that they rarely see themselves as villains. They see themselves as victims, as defenders, as people responding to provocation or threat. The person who beats their partner sees themselves as maintaining necessary discipline. The person who participates in genocide sees themselves as protecting their people from existential threat. The torturer sees themselves as extracting information to prevent greater harm. This phenomenon is called moral disengagement, a set of psychological mechanisms that allow people to commit harmful acts without experiencing the guilt and shame that would normally prevent such behavior. Albert Bandura identified several mechanisms. Moral justification, where the act is framed as serving a higher purpose. euphemistic labeling, where harsh actions are given sanitized names, advantageous comparison, where the act is compared to worse alternatives to make it seem acceptable, displacement of responsibility, where the person claims they were just following orders, diffusion of responsibility, where individual accountability is diluted in group action. These mechanisms do not simply excuse evil after the fact, they enable it in the first place. When we can convince ourselves that what we are doing is not really harmful, or that the harm is justified, or that we are not personally responsible, then the normal barriers to cruelty fall away. The conscience, which would protest the harming of another human being, is silenced through these psychological maneuvers. Carl Jung understood evil through the concept of the shadow, the dark side of the psyche containing everything we have denied and rejected about ourselves. The shadow is not evil in itself. It simply contains all the capacities we refuse to acknowledge: aggression, selfishness, cruelty, hatred, the capacity to harm. When we deny these capacities in ourselves, when we insist that we are purely good, the shadow does not disappear. It grows stronger in the darkness, and when it emerges, it does so in uncontrolled and often destructive ways. Jung argued that the greatest evils are committed by people who believe themselves to be purely good, who have completely identified with their persona and disowned their shadow. These people cannot see the darkness within themselves, and so they project it onto others. The enemy becomes the repository of all evil, wholly bad, deserving of destruction. And in destroying this projected evil, the person believes themselves to be doing good, never recognizing that they are acting out the very darkness they refuse to acknowledge in themselves. This is why moral certainty is so dangerous. The person who knows with absolute conviction that they are right, that their cause is just, that their enemies are evil, this person is capable of almost anything. They have eliminated doubt, eliminated the internal voice that might question or restrain. They have merged their personal will with what they perceive as cosmic justice, and in that merger, ordinary moral considerations no longer apply. Nietzsche saw clearly that those who fight monsters risk becoming monsters themselves, that staring too long into the abyss means the abyss stares back into you. The person who dedicates themselves to destroying evil must be careful not to adopt evil's methods, not to become so consumed by the fight that they lose sight of what they are fighting for. History is full of revolutionaries who became tyrants, of crusaders who became inquisitors, of those who claimed to fight evil while perpetrating it. But Nietzsche also understood something else, that conventional morality, what he called slave morality, can itself be a form of evil when it suppresses life, when it denies human vitality and creativity in service of conformity and control. The good person, following all the rules, condemning all transgression, can commit evil through their rigid adherence to moral codes that crush spontaneity and authentic being. This is not moral relativism, the claim that all moral systems are equally valid or that evil does not exist. It is the recognition that evil is complex, that it operates through mechanisms of self-justification and moral certainty, that it often wears the mask of righteousness, that the line between good and evil runs not between people or groups, but through every human heart. Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who survived the Soviet gulags, wrote that the line separating good and evil passes not through states, not between classes, not between political parties, but right through every human heart. And even within hearts overwhelmed by evil, he found one small bridgehead of good. And in the best of hearts, there remains a small corner of evil. This is the foundation for understanding evil psychologically. It is not other, not alien, not confined to a separate class of monsters. It is human, deeply human, and the capacity for it lives in all of us, waiting for the circumstances that will allow it to emerge, evil and the shadow, what we deny in ourselves. Carl Jung's concept of the shadow is perhaps the most important psychological framework for understanding how good people become capable of evil. The shadow is not synonymous with evil, but it contains the raw material from which evil acts emerge. Our capacity for aggression, our selfishness, our cruelty, our hatred, our desire to dominate and destroy. These capacities are not aberrations. They are parts of being human, part of our evolutionary inheritance, part of the full spectrum of human possibility. In childhood, we learn which parts of ourselves are acceptable and which must be hidden. We learn that anger is bad, that selfishness is wrong, that aggression must be suppressed. And so we push these qualities into the unconscious. We tell ourselves we are not angry when we are furious. We convince ourselves we are generous when we are actually resentful about giving. We believe ourselves to be peaceful when violence simmers beneath the surface. The parts we cannot acknowledge do not disappear. They descend into the shadow. But what lives in the shadow grows distorted. Healthy anger, which might protect boundaries and signal when something is wrong, becomes rage when suppressed and denied. Normal self-interest, which might ensure we meet our own needs, becomes pathological selfishness when pushed underground. The capacity for appropriate aggression, which might allow us to stand up for ourselves or others, becomes cruelty when it can only emerge in uncontrolled bursts. The person who has completely disowned their shadow, who insists they are purely good, purely loving, purely peaceful, is the most dangerous person of all. They have no relationship with their own darkness, no conscious access to their aggressive impulses, no ability to regulate what they cannot acknowledge. And so when the shadow finally breaks through, as it inevitably will, it does so in extreme and often destructive forms. This is why the most horrific atrocities are often committed by people who believe themselves to be righteous, who see themselves as forces of good fighting against evil. The Nazis believed they were purifying the world, protecting their people, creating a better future. The Inquisitors believed they were saving souls, protecting the faith, doing God's work. The Khmer Rouge believed they were building a perfect society, liberating the oppressed, creating heaven on earth. In each case, the perpetrators had completely identified with the good and projected all evil onto their victims. Jung called this projection, the psychological mechanism by which we attribute our own disowned qualities to others. We cannot see the hatred in ourselves, and so we see it in them. We cannot acknowledge our own capacity for cruelty, and so we perceive them as cruel and deserving of harsh treatment. We cannot face our own darkness, and so we make them into darkness incarnate, into monsters who must be destroyed. This projection serves a psychological function. It protects us from having to face our own shadow. As long as the evil is out there, in them, we do not have to look at what is in here, in ourselves. As long as we are fighting the bad guys, we can maintain our identity as the good guys. The external enemy becomes essential to our internal sense of goodness. We need them to be evil so that we can be good. But projection also makes evil possible. Once we have dehumanized the other, once we have made them into a repository of pure evil, then anything we do to them becomes justified. They are not really human anymore in our perception. They are threats, vermin, obstacles to be eliminated. The normal empathy that would prevent us from harming another person no longer applies because we no longer perceive them as persons. They have become objects. It's not thous. The shadow also contains what Jung called the destructive aspect of the self. There is within every psyche not just the capacity for individual acts of cruelty, but something larger, something archetypal, what mythology represents as demons or devils or forces of chaos and destruction. This is not literal demonic possession. It is the recognition that there are energies within the psyche that seek destruction, that find perverse pleasure in harm, that are drawn toward darkness. When we deny this destructive aspect completely, when we insist that we contain only constructive, loving, positive energies, we give this destructive force even more power. It operates autonomously, outside conscious control, erupting in ways we cannot predict or prevent. The person who suddenly explodes in rage, who commits an act completely out of character, who surprises even themselves with their capacity for cruelty, this person has been possessed by the shadow they refuse to acknowledge. Integration of the shadow does not mean acting on every dark impulse. It means acknowledging these impulses, recognizing them as part of ourselves, developing a conscious relationship with them so they can be understood and channeled rather than erupting destructively. The person who knows they are capable of violence is less likely to commit violence than the person who believes themselves incapable of it, because the former has conscious access to and regulation of these impulses, while the latter does not. Marie-Louise von Franz, Jung's closest collaborator, wrote about the importance of facing our own evil. She argued that we must acknowledge the capacity for evil within ourselves, must imagine ourselves in the position of perpetrators, must ask honestly what we might do in circumstances of extreme pressure or fear or moral ambiguity. This is uncomfortable work. It forces us to recognize that we are not as different from those who commit atrocities as we would like to believe. But this recognition is also protective. When we know our own capacity for evil, we can guard against it. We can notice when we are beginning to dehumanize others, when we are projecting our shadow onto groups or individuals, when we are becoming morally certain in ways that eliminate doubt and self-questioning. We can catch ourselves in the early stages of the psychological processes that lead to evil, rather than only recognizing what we have done after the fact. The shadow work required to prevent evil is therefore not about becoming more good in the conventional sense. It is about becoming more whole, more conscious of the full range of human capacities within us. It is about developing a relationship with our darkness, so that it does not control us from the unconscious. It is about acknowledging that we too could commit terrible acts under certain circumstances, not because we are bad, but because we are human. And this capacity is part of being human. Jung believed that the great evils of the 20th century, the world wars, the genocides, the totalitarian regimes, all emerged because Western culture had collectively denied the shadow, had believed in inevitable progress, had convinced itself that civilization had transcended the dark aspects of human nature. When the shadow was denied on a cultural level, it erupted with catastrophic force. The lesson, Jung argued, is that we must face our darkness individually and collectively, or it will face us in forms we cannot control. The mechanism of evil, how good people do terrible things. The most disturbing revelation from psychological research on evil is not that some people are monsters, but that ordinary people, people psychologically indistinguishable from ourselves, can be induced to commit terrible acts under surprisingly mundane conditions. The transformation from decent person to perpetrator of cruelty does not require exceptional depravity or psychopathy. It requires only the right situational pressures, the right authority structure, the right incremental steps that lead from small transgressions to unthinkable atrocities. Stanley Milgram's obedience experiments in the 1960s revealed this with shocking clarity. Ordinary Americans, volunteers who thought they were participating in a study on learning, were instructed by an authority figure in a lab coat to administer what they believed were increasingly severe electric shocks to another person. The shocks were not real, but the participants believed they were. And despite hearing screams of pain, despite the supposed victim begging them to stop, despite their own obvious distress, 65% of participants administered what they believed was a potentially lethal 450 volt shock, simply because the authority figure told them to continue. These were not sadists. They were normal people, teachers and engineers and salespeople, people with families and friends, people who would describe themselves as good and moral. Many of them were visibly distressed, sweating, trembling, protesting verbally even as they continued to obey. But when the experimenter said, "The experiment requires that you continue," most of them did. Authority overrode conscience. The situation overpowered individual morality. Milgram's work reveals several mechanisms that facilitate obedience to immoral authority. First, there is the gradual escalation, what he called the foot in the door phenomenon. Participants did not start by administering severe shocks. They began with 15 volts, a mild shock that seemed harmless, then 30 volts, then 45. Each increment was small, barely different from the last, and once they had administered one shock, it became harder to refuse the next. Having already gone this far, they felt committed to continuing. The decision to harm was never made in a single moment, but through a series of small steps, each of which seemed justifiable in the context of what had already been done. Second, there was the diffusion of responsibility. The participants did not feel fully responsible for their actions because the authority figure had taken responsibility. When they expressed concern, they were told, "I am responsible for what happens." This reassurance allowed them to continue while maintaining the belief that they were not truly accountable for the harm being inflicted. Someone else had made the decision. They were merely following instructions. Third, there was the power of the situation to redefine moral reality. Inside the laboratory, with the authority of science, with the formal structure of the experiment, normal moral rules seemed suspended. The participants entered a different psychological space where harming another person became acceptable because it was part of a legitimate procedure. The situation created its own moral framework that overrode the broader ethical principles participants would normally follow. Philip Zimbardo's Stanford prison experiment demonstrated similar dynamics. College students were randomly assigned to be either guards or prisoners in a simulated prison. Within days, the guards had become sadistic, subjecting prisoners to psychological torture, forcing them into degrading acts, stripping them of dignity. The prisoners became passive, depressed, showing signs of extreme stress. The experiment had to be stopped after 6 days because the situation had become too harmful, too real. These were good kids, psychologically healthy, from good families, attending one of the country's best universities. Nothing in their backgrounds predicted that they would become cruel or that they would submit to cruelty. But the situation, the roles they were assigned, the power differential, the lack of oversight, these factors transformed them in ways that shocked even Zimbardo himself. The mechanism here was role adoption. Once the students put on the guard uniform, once they were given authority over the prisoners, they began to act according to what they thought guards should do. They did not consciously decide to be cruel. They were performing a role, and the role included dominance, control, the assertion of power. The prisoners, similarly, adopted the submissive role, internalizing their powerlessness until it became real. But there is something more subtle happening in these transformations. The perpetrators of evil almost never experience themselves as doing evil. They experience themselves as doing their job, following the rules, maintaining order, serving a higher purpose. The guard does not think, "I will torture this prisoner." The guard thinks, "I must maintain discipline, I must show strength. I cannot let them think they can disrespect me." This is what Albert Bandura called moral disengagement, the cognitive restructuring that allows people to commit harmful acts while maintaining a positive self-image. The language changes. Torture becomes enhanced interrogation. Killing becomes neutralizing the target. Ethnic cleansing replaces genocide. These are not just euphemisms for public consumption. They are psychological tools that allow perpetrators to do what they do without facing the moral reality of their actions. Comparison also plays a role. Yes, we are harsh, but we are not as bad as they are. Yes, we harm people, but we prevent greater harm. The acts are placed in a framework where they appear necessary, even moderate compared to alternatives. The person who tortures tells themselves they are preventing terrorist attacks. The person who participates in genocide tells themselves they are preventing their own people's destruction. The harm they cause is reframed as the lesser evil, as the necessary price of preventing something worse. Dehumanization is perhaps the most crucial mechanism. When we stop seeing the other as fully human, when we reduce them to a category, to vermin or cockroaches or enemies or criminals, then our natural empathy no longer applies. We do not feel for them as we would feel for people we recognize as like ourselves. They become objects to be managed, threats to be eliminated, problems to be solved. This dehumanization is not usually complete or immediate. It happens gradually through language, through propaganda, through the accumulation of small acts of cruelty that make the next act easier. The person who commits genocide did not wake up one day deciding to kill thousands. They began by accepting the rhetoric that certain people were problems, then by tolerating discrimination, then by participating in lesser forms of violence. Each step prepared them for the next, eroding the psychological barriers that would normally prevent such acts. The mechanism of evil is therefore not about monsters making monstrous choices. It is about normal psychological processes: obedience to authority, conformity to group norms, role adoption, gradual escalation, moral disengagement, dehumanization, operating in contexts that make the unthinkable seem necessary, even righteous. Understanding these mechanisms does not excuse evil, but it reveals how vulnerable we all are to becoming perpetrators if we are not vigilant, if we do not actively resist these psychological processes, when we notice them operating in ourselves or in the groups we belong to. Evil and identity, the existential dimension. The existentialist understood that evil is not simply a moral category, but an existential one, deeply connected to how we relate to freedom, to choice, to the burden of creating meaning in a meaningless universe. Jean-Paul Sartre's famous dictum that we are condemned to be free points to the terrible responsibility at the heart of human existence. We cannot escape choice. Even refusing to choose is a choice. And in our choices, we create not just our actions, but ourselves, our identity, our very being. But this freedom is unbearable for many people. It means we are responsible, fully responsible, for who we become and what we do. There is no script to follow, no predetermined path, no external authority that can relieve us of the burden of decision. And so we flee from freedom into what Sartre called bad faith, the denial of our fundamental freedom, the pretense that we are determined by forces outside ourselves. Bad faith takes many forms, but one of the most dangerous is the denial of moral agency. The person who says, "I had no choice, I was following orders, I was just doing my job," this person is in bad faith. They are denying their freedom in order to escape responsibility for their actions. But the existentialist insight is that we always have a choice. We can always say no, even when the consequences are severe. The concentration camp guard could have refused. The person committing atrocities could have walked away. They chose not to, and that choice, however constrained by circumstances, was still theirs. This is a harsh truth, because it means we cannot simply blame the situation, cannot fully excuse even those under tremendous pressure. But it is also an empowering truth, because it means we retain moral agency even in the darkest circumstances. Viktor Frankl, surviving the Nazi death camps, witnessed that between stimulus and response, there is a space, and in that space is our power to choose. Some prisoners became brutal, others maintained their humanity even in hell. The circumstances did not determine the response. The individual chose. But Sartre also recognized something more disturbing. We are not just free to choose good or evil. We are free to define what good and evil mean. There is no objective moral law written into the fabric of the universe. There is only human freedom creating values through choice. This is what Nietzsche meant when he proclaimed that God is dead. Without a divine lawgiver, without transcendent moral truth, we are alone with our freedom, forced to create our own values. This creates what some call the existential vacuum, a sense of meaninglessness, a void where moral certainty once provided structure. And in this vacuum, evil can flourish, when there is no objective good to orient toward, when all values are human creations, when nothing is forbidden by cosmic law, then anything becomes possible. Dostoevsky wrote that if God does not exist, everything is permitted. The loss of absolute moral foundations opens the door to nihilism, to the belief that nothing matters, that there is no real difference between good and evil. But the existentialists argued that this nihilistic conclusion is itself a form of bad faith. Yes, we must create our own values. Yes, there is no objective moral law. But this does not mean all choices are equivalent. We can still choose authenticity over inauthenticity. We can still create meaning through how we live. We can still affirm certain values, even while recognizing that we are their source, rather than discovering them in some transcendent realm. The question becomes, what kind of person will you choose to be? What values will you create through your choices? How will you use your freedom? Will you choose to affirm life or to destroy it? To create or to annihilate? To recognize the humanity of others or to reduce them to objects? These choices are not prescribed by nature or by God. They are ours to make, and in making them we define ourselves. This is where evil enters as an existential category. Evil is not just wrong according to some external moral code. It is a failure of authentic existence, a denial of our own freedom and the freedom of others, a choice to reduce being to nothingness. When we harm another person, we deny their fundamental freedom, we reduce them from a subject to an object, we annihilate their capacity to create meaning and value. Evil is therefore an assault on being itself, an attempt to impose nothingness on existence. Kierkegaard saw evil in the despair of not willing to be oneself, in the refusal to accept the responsibility of authentic existence. The person who conforms completely to social expectations, who never questions, who never chooses for themselves, this person has committed a kind of spiritual suicide, has allowed their authentic self to die, and from this death, from this refusal of authentic being, comes the capacity for the worst kinds of evil because there is no self there to resist, no authentic core that might say no. Heidegger's analysis of Das Man, the anonymous they, points to similar dynamics. When we live according to what one does, when we simply follow the crowd, when we never take a stand on our own being, we become capable of anything. The Nazis were people who lost themselves in Das Man, who became pure function, pure role, pure obedience to the collective. They ceased to be authentic individuals capable of moral choice and became instruments of a larger system. The existential dimension of evil is therefore about the relationship between freedom and identity. We become evil not through some inherent flaw in our nature, but through the choices we make about how to use our freedom. We can choose to face the burden of authentic existence, to create values that affirm life and recognize the humanity of others. Or we can flee from freedom into conformity, into obedience, into roles that relieve us of responsibility, while allowing us to commit atrocities in the name of duty or ideology. Camus understood that the absurd, the confrontation between human need for meaning and the universe's indifference, can lead to either authentic existence or to nihilistic destruction. The person who accepts the absurd, who creates meaning despite meaninglessness, who affirms life despite its ultimate futility, this person chooses authentic being. But the person who responds to the absurd with rage, who seeks to impose meaning through violence and domination, who attempts to force the universe to acknowledge them through destruction, this person chooses evil. This is why revolutionary movements that begin with idealistic visions so often end in terror. They cannot accept the absurd, cannot tolerate that the universe does not care about their cause, cannot bear that meaning must be created rather than imposed. And so they try to force meaning into existence through violence, through purges, through the elimination of everyone who does not share their vision. They become what they claimed to oppose. The existential answer to evil is not a new moral code or a return to religious certainty. It is the acceptance of responsibility, the choice to use our freedom in ways that affirm rather than deny existence, that recognize rather than erase the humanity of others. It is the decision to create values that we can live with, that we can defend not because some authority commands them, but because we have chosen them freely, because they express who we have decided to become. We are not predetermined to be good or evil. We are radically free, and in that freedom lies both the possibility of evil and the possibility of its transcendence. The question is not what human nature is, but what we will choose to make of ourselves. And that choice, made moment by moment, defines not just our actions but our very being. The neuroscience and psychology of moral transgression. Modern neuroscience has begun to map the neural architecture of morality and its violation, and what we discover challenges many of our assumptions about evil. The brain does not have a single moral center, no discrete region responsible for distinguishing right from wrong. Instead, moral cognition emerges from the interaction of multiple neural systems. Regions involved in emotion, in reasoning, in perspective taking, in reward and punishment, in impulse control. When people make moral judgments, brain imaging reveals a network of activation spanning the prefrontal cortex, the temporal lobes, the anterior cingulate cortex, and the amygdala. The ventromedial prefrontal cortex appears crucial for integrating emotional responses with rational evaluation. Damage to this region, through injury or disease, can leave a person able to reason about moral questions in the abstract, but unable to feel the emotional weight that normally motivates moral behavior. The famous case of Phineas Gage illustrates this. After a railway accident drove an iron rod through his frontal lobes, Gage's personality transformed. Previously responsible and moral, he became impulsive, profane, incapable of planning or following social norms. His reasoning abilities remained intact, but the neural systems that connected reason to emotion, that gave moral knowledge its motivating force, were destroyed. He could know what was right but could not feel it, and without feeling it, he could not consistently choose it. Psychopathy provides another window into the neuroscience of evil. Psychopaths are not insane. They understand moral rules. They can distinguish right from wrong in the abstract, but they lack the emotional responses that make morality personally compelling. When shown images of people in distress, the amygdala shows reduced activation compared to normal individuals. They do not feel empathy automatically. They can simulate it cognitively when it serves their purposes, but the emotional resonance, the automatic mirroring of others' pain, is absent or severely diminished. Research by James Blair and others has shown that psychopaths process moral violations differently than normal individuals. When presented with moral transgressions, most people show strong activation in regions associated with emotion and disgust. Psychopaths show more activation in regions associated with abstract reasoning. They approach moral questions like puzzles to be solved, rather than as situations evoking emotional response. This is why they can harm others without guilt or remorse. The neural systems that would normally generate these protective emotions are not functioning properly. But psychopaths represent only a tiny fraction of those who commit evil acts. Most perpetrators of atrocity are neurologically normal. Their capacity for empathy exists. Their moral emotions function. So how do normal brains commit evil? The answer lies in how the brain processes group membership, authority, and moral disengagement. Neuroscience reveals that we process in-group and out-group members differently at the neural level. When viewing faces of our own ethnic or social group, we show activation in regions associated with mentalizing, with thinking about what the other person is thinking and feeling. But when viewing out-group faces, particularly when that outgroup has been characterized as threatening, we show reduced activity in these regions and increased activity in the amygdala, the threat detection system. This means that at a neural level, we are processing outgroup members more as threats than as persons. The automatic empathy that would normally prevent us from harming them is dampened. The cognitive resources we would normally devote to understanding their perspective are not allocated. We see them less as minds and more as objects, not through conscious choice, but through automatic neural processing shaped by social categorization. This neural differentiation can be manipulated. Studies show that propaganda, repeated exposure to dehumanizing rhetoric, training that emphasizes threat from outgroups, all of these can intensify the neural distinction between us and them. The brain becomes increasingly primed to see outgroup members as different in kind, rather than just different in category, as things rather than as people. The mirror neuron system, which allows us to simulate others' experiences, to feel what they feel, shows reduced activation when we observe harm being done to outgroup members compared to in-group members. This is not conscious suppression of empathy, it is automatic neural processing. Our brains literally do not mirror the suffering of those we have categorized as other, with the same intensity that we mirror the suffering of those we recognize as us. Authority also affects neural processing of moral decisions. When people are told they are not responsible for the consequences of their actions, when authority has been established, regions of the prefrontal cortex associated with personal agency and moral reflection show decreased activation. It is as if the brain is offloading responsibility to the authority figure, reducing its own moral processing in situations where someone else is nominally in charge. Research on moral decision-making has also revealed the role of cognitive load and stress. When people are tired, stressed, rushed, or cognitively overloaded, they rely more on automatic processes and less on deliberative moral reasoning. The prefrontal cortex, which is crucial for self-control and moral deliberation, is metabolically expensive. When resources are depleted, its functioning degrades. This is why atrocities often occur in contexts of chaos, stress, and confusion, where people's capacity for careful moral reasoning is compromised. The neuroscience of moral development shows that children are not born with fully formed moral capacities. The prefrontal regions crucial for moral reasoning are among the last to mature, not fully developed until the mid-20s. Young people have moral emotions, have empathy, have sense of fairness, but their ability to override impulses, to consider long-term consequences, to resist peer pressure, these capacities are still developing. This is why adolescents are particularly vulnerable to being drawn into violence and cruelty, not because they are inherently more evil, but because their neural architecture for moral self-regulation is incomplete. Neuroplasticity reveals that repeated moral transgressions change the brain. The first time someone harms another person, if they have normal moral emotions, they experience guilt, shame, distress. These negative emotions are aversive. But if the behavior is repeated, if circumstances force or encourage continued transgression, the brain adapts. The emotional response diminishes. What once caused intense distress becomes tolerable, then routine, then even rewarding as other motivations, group approval, obedience to authority, ideological commitment, become associated with the behavior. This is the neural basis of moral numbing, the process by which perpetrators become desensitized to the harm they cause. It is not that they were born without conscience. It is that conscience, like any neural system, adapts to repeated stimulation. The warning signals weaken. The protective emotions fade. What remains is the ability to commit terrible acts without the internal resistance that would have once made them impossible. But neuroscience also offers hope. The brain retains plasticity throughout life. Neural patterns established through participation in evil can be disrupted and rebuilt. Empathy can be reactivated. Moral emotions can be rekindled. The capacity for guilt and remorse can return. This is not automatic or easy, but it is possible. Some perpetrators, removed from the situations that fostered their cruelty, confronted with the humanity of their victims, experience genuine transformation as their neural processing of others shifts back toward recognition of shared humanity, beyond evil, integration and moral awakening. If evil is so deeply woven into human psychology, if ordinary people can commit atrocities under the right circumstances, if our brains are wired to dehumanize outgroups and obey authority, then what hope exists for preventing evil or transforming those who have committed it? This is perhaps the most important question we can ask, because the alternative, despair about human nature, leads either to cynicism or to the very moral certainty that enables evil in the first place. The path beyond evil begins with what Jung called shadow integration, the conscious acknowledgement of our own capacity for cruelty, aggression, and harm. This is not about indulging these capacities or acting on them. It is about bringing them into consciousness so they can be understood and regulated, rather than erupting from the unconscious in uncontrolled forms. The person who knows they are capable of evil, who has faced this truth about themselves, is far less likely to commit evil than the person who believes themselves purely good. This integration requires brutal honesty. We must ask ourselves uncomfortable questions. What would I do under extreme pressure? If I were born in Nazi Germany, would I have resisted or complied? If I were assigned the role of God in a prison, would I abuse my power? If my group decided to harm another group, would I participate or would I stand apart? These are not abstract questions. They are invitations to recognize our vulnerability to the same psychological mechanisms that have led others to commit atrocities. The answer is almost never, I would definitely resist. The honest answer is, I do not know. And that uncertainty terrifies me. But this terror, this recognition of our own moral fragility, is protective. It creates vigilance. It makes us attentive to the early signs of the processes that lead to evil. The dehumanizing language, the us versus them thinking, the moral certainty, the obedience to authority that overrides conscience, the gradual escalation from small transgressions to larger ones. Empathy is also crucial, but not the automatic empathy that our mirror neurons provide for those we recognize as like ourselves. We need what psychologist Paul Bloom calls rational compassion, the deliberate choice to extend moral consideration to those our brains automatically categorize as other. This requires effort. It requires overriding our neural defaults. It requires consciously reminding ourselves that the person in the outgroup, the enemy, the stranger, is a human being with an inner world as complex as our own. This rational compassion must be practiced. We must deliberately seek out encounters with those different from ourselves, must listen to their stories, must allow our abstract knowledge that they are human to become felt knowledge through direct experience. We must resist the propaganda that dehumanizes, must question the rhetoric that reduces complex humans to threatening categories, must refuse to participate in the linguistic violence that precedes and enables physical violence. Moral education must also shift from teaching rules to teaching moral reasoning and moral courage. Rules are important, but they are not enough. The Nazis had rules. The Inquisition had rules. Every great evil in history has been committed by people following rules. What we need is the capacity to question rules, to recognize when obedience becomes complicity, to stand apart from the group when the group is wrong. This requires cultivating what Hannah Arendt called the ability to think, to engage in internal dialogue, to question our own actions and motivations. The person who never thinks, who simply follows, who never asks whether what they are doing is right, this person is vulnerable to becoming an instrument of evil. But the person who maintains an active inner life, who questions and reflects and examines, this person has a defense against becoming a thoughtless perpetrator. There must also be structures of accountability, systems that make it difficult for evil to flourish unchecked. Individual moral courage is important, but it is not sufficient. We need institutions that distribute power rather than concentrating it, that encourage dissent rather than demanding conformity, that protect whistleblowers rather than punishing them, that maintain transparency rather than operating in secrecy. Evil thrives in hierarchies without accountability, in systems where questioning is forbidden, in contexts where power is absolute and unchecked. Transformation of those who have committed evil is possible but difficult. It requires several elements. First, the person must exit the situation that enabled their harmful behavior. As long as they remain in the role, in the group, in the ideology that justified their actions, genuine change is nearly impossible. They must step outside, must gain distance, must see their actions from a different perspective. Second, they must encounter the humanity of their victims. Perpetrators maintain their actions through dehumanization, through seeing their victims as objects or threats, rather than as people. When forced to confront the actual human beings they harmed, when they hear their stories, see their suffering, recognize them as fully human, the psychological defenses that enabled evil begin to crumble. This encounter is painful, often leads to overwhelming guilt and shame, but it is necessary for genuine transformation. Third, they must develop what psychologists call a redemptive narrative, a way of understanding their past actions that acknowledges the harm without destroying the possibility of a different future. This is delicate work. The person must accept full responsibility for what they did, must not minimize or excuse, must feel appropriate guilt, but they must also find a way to live with that guilt, to use it as motivation for different choices, rather than being paralyzed by shame or denying responsibility to protect themselves from unbearable self-knowledge. Some perpetrators achieve this transformation, former members of hate groups who become advocates for tolerance, soldiers who committed atrocities who dedicate themselves to peace work, people who harmed others, who spend the rest of their lives trying to repair what they broke. These transformations are not redemption in the sense of erasing what was done. The harm remains. The victims still suffered, but they demonstrate that human beings are not fixed, that those who chose evil can choose differently, that moral awakening is possible even after terrible transgression. But prevention is far more important than transformation after the fact. We must create cultures that resist the psychological mechanisms that enable evil. This means teaching critical thinking, fostering empathy across group boundaries, distributing power, protecting dissent, maintaining transparency, and above all, cultivating the capacity for moral courage, for saying no even when everyone else is saying yes, for standing apart even when the costs are high. The philosopher Emmanuel Levinas argued that ethics begins not with rules or principles but with the face of the other, with a direct encounter with another human being that makes a claim on us. When we truly see the other, not as object or category but as a unique person facing us, we are called to respond, to take responsibility, to recognize that their suffering matters. Evil requires that we refuse this call, that we look away from the face, that we reduce the person to something less than human. Resistance to evil requires that we accept the call, that we look at the face, that we allow ourselves to be claimed by the other's humanity. Conclusion: the psychology of evil reveals the most uncomfortable truth about human nature. We are all capable of terrible acts. There is no clear line separating the good people from the evil ones. No absolute protection against becoming perpetrators of harm. The capacity for evil lives in every human psyche, waiting for the circumstances that will activate it, the pressures that will override conscience, the ideologies that will justify cruelty, the authority that will command obedience. But this recognition is not cause for despair. It is a call to vigilance. When we know that we are vulnerable to becoming perpetrators, we can guard against the psychological processes that lead there. We can notice when we are beginning to dehumanize others, when we are following authority without question, when we are conforming to group norms that violate our values, when we are justifying small transgressions that might lead to larger ones. Evil is not primarily a moral category, but a psychological one. It emerges not from demonic possession or inherent depravity, but from ordinary psychological mechanisms operating in particular contexts. Obedience to authority, conformity to group norms, diffusion of responsibility, moral disengagement, dehumanization. These are not aberrations. They are normal features of human psychology that can be exploited to make good people do terrible things. Understanding these mechanisms does not excuse evil. Those who commit atrocities are still responsible for their choices, but understanding reveals how vulnerable we all are, how the difference between perpetrator and resistor is often not moral superiority, but circumstance, opportunity, the presence or absence of certain social supports and moral frameworks. Jung's insight about the shadow remains crucial. We must face our own capacity for evil, must integrate rather than deny our darkness, must develop a conscious relationship with the aggressive, destructive aspects of our nature. The person who claims to be purely good, who has no relationship with their own shadow, is more dangerous than the person who knows their darkness and struggles with it consciously. The existentialists remind us that we are radically free, that even under extreme pressure we retain the capacity to choose, that circumstances do not determine our response. Some people resisted the Nazis. Some prisoners in the camps maintained their humanity. Some guards refused to torture. These examples prove that choice remains even when it is costly, that we are not simply products of our situation but agents capable of moral courage. Neuroscience reveals that our brains can be shaped toward empathy or toward cruelty, that repeated moral transgressions change neural processing, but also that plasticity remains, that transformation is possible, that those who have committed evil can develop different patterns if they are removed from the context that enabled harm and exposed to the humanity of those they harmed. The path beyond evil is not about becoming perfectly good. It is about becoming conscious, about recognizing our vulnerability to the mechanisms that enable evil, about cultivating empathy across group boundaries, about maintaining the capacity to question and resist, about creating structures that distribute power and protect dissent, about staying connected to the humanity of others even when pressured to dehumanize them. We must teach not just what to think, but how to think, not just obedience, but moral courage, not just in-group loyalty, but universal human dignity. We must create cultures that value questioning over conformity, that protect those who dissent, that make transparency the norm and secrecy the exception. Most importantly, we must remember that evil is not other. It is not something that happens elsewhere, to other people, in other times. It is a possibility within each of us, within our communities, within our institutions. The question is not whether we are capable of evil. The question is whether we will recognize this capacity and guard against it, whether we will choose consciousness over denial, whether we will stand for what is right, even when it is difficult. The line between good and evil runs through every human heart. We choose, moment by moment, which side of that line we will stand on. And those choices, accumulated over a lifetime, determine not just what we do, but who we become. If this exploration of evil has disturbed you, if it has challenged your assumptions about human nature and your confidence in your own goodness, then it has done its work. Comfort is the enemy of moral vigilance. We must remain uncomfortable with our capacity for evil if we are to guard against it. Subscribe to this channel if you seek content that does not offer easy answers or moral certainty, that explores the darkest aspects of human psychology with honesty and depth, that invites you to face what is difficult rather than what is comfortable. Share this with those who need to understand that evil is not other, that we are all vulnerable to becoming perpetrators if we are not vigilant. Leave a comment sharing your reflections on evil, on your own capacity for harm, on moments when you recognize these mechanisms operating in yourself or in groups you belong to. This community exists for those willing to face uncomfortable truths, to examine our shadow, to take responsibility for our moral choices. Remember, you are capable of evil. This is not an insult. It is a fact of being human. The question is whether you will face this capacity consciously, will guard against the psychological mechanisms that activate it, will choose to stand on the side of recognizing humanity rather than denying it. These choices are not made once. They are made daily in small moments, in how we speak about others, in whether we question authority, in whether we resist dehumanization when we encounter it. Evil begins in small moments. So does resistance to evil. Choose consciousness, choose questioning, choose to see the humanity in others even when it is difficult. Choose to stand apart from the group when the group is wrong. these choices matter more than you know.